All of the same problems that we deal with every day in the real world, they have in this fantasy world. They're just, dressed up a little different.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Peter V. Brett.
Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. I'll be talking more about her as the month goes on. Also, thanks to R.J. Pinero, his upcoming book, Avenue of Regrets, is an engrossing psychological thriller coming up in November. We're going to be talking about it more this month and talking with R.J. Thanks to him for sponsoring the show. As always, after the show, there's an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am super excited to have Peter V. Brett back on the show with me. We were just trying to figure out right before we started recording. It looks like it's been about a year since Peter was with us. At the time, his brand new book was The Core, which wrapped up the main storyline of the Demon Cycle, and we had a great time. But Peter has a new book that is just released. It's a novella in the same world as the Demon Cycle, and it's called Barren. And I'm happy to have you back to talk about it. Peter, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Hank. Thanks for having me again. Really glad to be here.
Yeah. So when we talked last year, The Core was out. It brought this massive story that you had envisioned and had been working toward for a number of years, and it brought it to this really satisfying conclusion. And but now we have a novella in the same world there. What was and I know this is like the third novella in this world that you published. Is that right?
It's actually the fourth.
Fourth. Okay. I'm sorry. I forgot.
Two of them were combined into one book.
Okay.
So that might be your...
I think that's probably what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, first off, what have you been up to over the last year, and how satisfying was it to have that main storyline finished when this was a world that you, as the writer, have been living in for so long?
I mean, the last year has been amazing and hectic and rewarding and exhausting. In addition to touring in multiple countries to promote the last book of the Demon Cycle, since it's come out, I did a book tour in the UK, I did a book tour in the US, I did a book tour in Poland, I did a book tour in Germany, and I've did a convention in Canada and a couple of other ones in the US, and so it's been sort of nonstop travel promoting the end of the series, which has been amazing. It's been so well received everywhere, and after 10 years since the first book came out, to get to finally get to the ending and let people know the ending that I sort of had in my mind all along has just been incredibly rewarding and wonderful. But it's also been a lot of time on the road, a lot of time away. And as we were talking about offline a moment ago, I've got a new baby at home. And so timing away from the baby has been a little tough. And certainly life has changed. Life changes dramatically when you have diapers to change and late night feedings and everything. So it's been quite a year.
Yeah, I bet. You've got this great graphic on the news page of your website, and you've got it titled "The Warded Man Continues Its March to World Domination." And you're talking about this tour and going all around the world promoting it and putting a a visual to that by looking at, all of the places that the book is just going gangbusters, and you showing up there. I mean, all of North America, a huge chunk of South America, China and Australia, and big chunks of Africa, and pretty much all of Europe. I mean, that's insane. Did you ever imagine anything like that when you had this idea for the story where demons attack humans and they have to figure out how to survive?
Not at all, really. I'm a big fan of the board game Risk.
Mm-hmm.
I used to have a regular group that would come over and we would spend hours playing Risk. This is before kids, and
when there were hours.
When the book, yeah, really. When the book's first published, I had sold rights in the U.S. and the U.K. and France and Germany, and I was kind of like, oh, it's so awesome! I'm getting published in all of these countries. Like, oh, we should take the Risk map and start coloring in the countries that I've quote unquote conquered. And so in some of those cases, like where the UK will have rights to publish the books in a lot of other countries, like, South Africa or something. And so they gave a list of countries where they have exclusive publishing rights. And so we took all of those countries and we started coloring them in. And I threw that up on my website as sort of a joke, but then one by one, as we got more and more foreign rights deals, like it stopped being a joke and just became awesome. So now we're published in 26 languages worldwide, and that's some of those languages cover more than one country. So say published in French, you get France and Belgium and parts of Switzerland. And so now that you have sort of colored in all the countries where the books are sold, it's overwhelming to look at. And I can't really believe that that's happened. 10 years ago, when it was just anybody, please read my book. I never, I would have dreams of being on the New York Times list or something, but the thought of being published all over the world never even occurred to me.
Yeah. We're not going to retell all the stories that we told last time when we talked. There's a link to the previous show in the show notes for anyone who hasn't heard that. You can go catch up. But just briefly, Peter, the idea behind the demon cycle. You've got these people that have been overrun, and they have been conquered and abused, and similar to a lot of fantasy, there's some similar tropes or ideas maybe, and there's the promise of a deliverer one day, and which is a common story, yet you tell it so differently, and it's such a fresh story than anything else that I had really read in the fantasy genre. Tell us a little bit about just the story in general, what it is, what the setup is, and do you think that the common ideas there are what resonate worldwide? That this is a story that resonates across cultures and languages and people.
Sure. So the basic premise of the Demon Cycle series is that it's set in a world that might be our world in a distant future, or might be a world that was very similar to ours. I'm very careful to not say one way or the other, because there are some readers who think it's one and some readers who think it's the other, and I like to, let them imagine what they want. But the idea is that at some point there was this technologically advanced society, and one night demons came back into the world after thousands of years, and burned all the libraries, destroyed the power plants, and basically knocked humanity back into a little house on the prairie level of technology. And the series opens up a little over 300 years later, when humanity has been hunted nearly to extinction, and people exist in these isolated villages, using magical symbols called wards to protect themselves. Wards are similar to holding up a cross to a vampire. Wards are symbols that you can draw on your home or around your crops or around your, on the barn or whatever, that create a magical barrier that demons can't pass through. But if the wards are damaged in any way, the demons can get through, and their sole desire is to hunt and kill everything that lives. And so we open up in this sort of very grim world where humanity is unable to fight back because the demons are immortal and they're immune to most weapons. Even the things that can hurt them, they heal so quickly that it's almost useless. And so without a way to fight back, humans are just hiding every night. And so what that gave me the opportunity to do was to really look into what it's like for people living under those conditions. How do they treat each other when they're hiding? The demons only come out at night. And so during the day, people work as hard as they can to provide for themselves and their family and exist. And then at night, they check the wards, hide, and just hope they see it through to the dawn. And that gives me the opportunity to say, well, all right, well, how do people treat each other under these circumstances? Like, what does that do to the psyche of individuals, and what does that do to humanity as a whole? And those were the stories that I was most interested in telling. And then the story focuses or opens about one character, a boy named Arlen, who sees a family member killed by demons and sees other people too afraid to help. And that is something that he can't stomach and can't stand. And so he goes on a quest to try and find a way to fight back against the demons. And it's something that people have been too afraid to do. And it really, his journey and the people he meets along the way really are what powers the story. And I have sort of done it as a series of character studies where I'll introduce a character as a child and show that some event in their childhood with a demon left them scarred or damaged in some way, but also pushed their life onto a different path than it would have otherwise have taken, and eventually gives them, each of them, their own way of fighting back. So one character uses music because he finds out that music, the demons don't like certain kinds of music, and other kinds of music can be used to influence them. And another character studies herbs and poisons and things, and learns that you can poison demons even if you can't fight them physically. And Arlen rediscovers magical symbols that allow you that you can paint them on your weapons, and they allow you to fight back. And so slowly but surely, humanity starts fighting its way back from the brink of extinction. That's the basic premise of the story. And it's grown into over the course of 5 novels and 4 novellas, it's probably close to 3 million words.
Wow.
Yeah, it got big. It got big fast.
Yeah, the core, I think, was over 800 pages just by itself. Is that right?
Yeah, the core is the longest one. It's 272,000 words.
Yeah, I was doing the word count math in my head, but yeah, wow, that's crazy. That's a lot of that's a lot of stuff to come out of an initial question, and it's amazing what world building can do. What do you think it is about the story that resonates with people across the world in different countries and languages and cultures?
I think that every culture in the world has stories about monsters that hide in the dark, has stories about magic symbols that can repel evil, whether it's drawing the evil eye or holding up a cross or, any of a number of other things. And so I think that these ideas and the fear of what's hiding in the dark and how it can affect your behavior and affect your life is something that everyone shares. And so I think that certainly played a part in why the books translate so well and why different countries have really gotten into the idea. The books also focus on the main character and some of the other characters who begin tattooing those magical symbols on themselves. And I found that there's a lot of stories in other countries that follow that same theme of someone who tattoos themselves with magical symbols in order to gain power, but also is then sort of cut off from having a normal life because of this, thing that they've done to themselves that makes them stand out to everyone else. And I think a lot of readers, who may feel for one reason or the other like they don't fit in, even if they haven't covered their body in tattoos, I think that kind of idea resonates with people of like, okay, now I've done something to myself that makes me feel like I don't belong anymore, but I did it for a reason, and that's who I am. And so these sorts of themes and stories are things that I think really a lot of people understand, and that's why it's done so well in translation, I guess. I don't know for sure.
That's it's funny to think about, though we're separated by miles and languages and all of the stuff that sets us apart. At the core, we're all so very alike, and that's one of the great things about the power of story. We can dress up stories with the window dressing of genre, yet at the heart of it, we're all telling stories about the human condition and how we interact with each other. It's and the genre stuff makes that conversation more powerful some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a way of illustrating or putting pressure on people in new ways, but like. As I said, like the stories on the surface, you can say like, oh, this is a story about demons, the same way that you look at, say, The Walking Dead and say that this is a story about zombies, or look at Game of Thrones and say that this is a story about dragons. But the reality is that the zombies or the demons or the dragons are really just a way of putting pressure on people, and the real story is the people. And people have plenty of pressures put on themselves in the real world and in real life. So it's a more colorful way of doing it, but the core story is always, this person is under pressure. How do they deal with it? And that's something that we can all relate to. And so I think that's why stories are so powerful, and that's why genre stories, even though they exist in a world that, could never really happen, resonate with people, and they and can be applied to people's own lives.
Right. The story of the Demon Cycle series is set in a near future, and like you said, that may or may not be Earth, but if it's not Earth, it's at least very similar. And there's technology, and then the technology has been broken, and all of this sort of stuff. So there are science fiction elements to this fantasy story, at least kind of in the root idea of it. Is that something that you are cognizant of, separating science fiction and fantasy? Do you think that they are closer than people give credit for, or do those designations even come into your mind?
I draw a very firm distinction between science fiction and fantasy, but I think that they both just take a different route to get to the same place. And so science fiction tells a story that couldn't happen in the real world through technology, and fantasy tells a story that couldn't happen in the real world through magic. Those, technology and magic are both sort of shortcuts to get you to a place where like something extraordinary is happening, and that is something that your characters need to deal with. And so at that basic level, like genre is genre, like fantasy and science fiction or urban fantasy or all of steampunk or all of the other sort of subdivisions are all essentially getting you to the same place, just taking a slightly different route. And there's certainly examples of the two of them blending together. You take Star Wars, which, on one hand, you've got the science fiction aspects of spaceships and blasters, and on the other hand, you've got the magic aspect of this all-powerful force that only certain people can use that gives them extraordinary powers. And the reason that they complement each other so well is because it's essentially the same, storytelling trick.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of science fiction is just fantasy separated by time and space.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you're using kind of real world anchoring, like and building familiar things that make people maybe easier for them to come into a fantasy world than just a completely made up world that looks nothing like our own. But then you introduce things like demons, and demons are something that we're all familiar with, and at least monsters and these kind of supernatural creatures, if not supernatural, at least otherworldly. Is that what's it like merging those things together? And when you introduce something supernatural, does that change the kind of storytelling that it is?
I don't know that it really changes the type of storytelling. I like I want to talk about things in the real world, because I want the stories to be things that people can relate to, that I can relate to, and that other readers can relate to. I want to talk about inequality. I want to talk about societal issues. I want to talk about religion. I want to talk about, all of these things that affect our daily lives all the time. And so I made the world similar enough to our own that they've got all the same problems that we've got. There are gender issues, and there are religious conflicts, and there's inequality, and there's the lack of resources, and all of the same problems that we deal with every day in the real world, they have in this fantasy world. They're just, dressed up a little differently. And through that, it allows me to talk about those things in a way that's not pointing fingers at particular people or espousing a particular, like attaching me to a real world faction of one kind or another, but also but lets the reader sort of focus on like this person and this problem and what is that like. And I think that is important for storytellers, because it allows us to talk about things that are touchy subjects in the real world in a way that's not as confrontational and judgy as it might otherwise be if we were, just arguing real world religion or real world politics or real world, what do we do about inequality or whatever.
Right. Speaking of that, what does storytelling and writing allow you to do? Like very specifically, when we're talking about wanting to talk about inequality, for instance, and you write a storyline, what is the balance between having the reader come to their own conclusions and probably the conclusion you wanted them to come to, but guiding them to a realization as opposed to just hitting them over the head with it? Like, what are the lines that you don't cross as a storyteller that separates preachy from enlightening?
Well, I mean, I think that what you need to do is be fair when you're addressing problems and when you're addressing arguments, to show both sides of it and show both sides of it in a fair and open way. And that can be really hard for some writers. And I think that it, if you have two characters having an argument and you know which side you believe in, and you make it so that the side that you believe in has all the good arguments, and the side that you don't believe in, like you you cherry pick the arguments so that they lose, then you're doing a disservice to your reader, you're doing a disservice to your story, and you're going to get called out for it, because then you're just hitting the reader over the head with what you want them to think. But if you are fair and you show both sides of it in a way that really makes people think about things in a way that they might not have otherwise, that's the real goal. And if they don't get to the conclusion that you want them to get to, like, that's part of it too. I mean, one of the wonderful things about reading is that 1 million people can read the same book and walk away with 1 million different takes on it. Nobody reads the same thing the same way, because we're all colored by our own beliefs and baggage and experiences. But so I have, the big culture war in my series. I've made a point of making sure that there's point of view characters from both cultures. People who are heroes, people who are villains, people who are true believers, people who are hypocrites. And to show that, both sides have a lot of the same values, and both sides really want to save the world. They're just coming at it from two different cultural directions, and that puts the two of them in conflict. And I think that because of that, that allows me to give sort of a fair conversation. And some of the best parts of the series to me are when, the main POV characters from these opposing cultures and belief systems get together and have an argument. Like, those are my favorite parts.
Absolutely. And when done well, it's a joy to read. But you kind of come away feeling like you've learned something, like you have, like meeting a new friend, and then not really realizing, that you are so different, yet at the end of the conversation, so much, in common. Another author who does that really well, and it surprises a lot of people, I think, is Brandon Sanderson. When he was on the show, we had this conversation, about, I think it's pretty public that he's a practicing Mormon, member of the LDS Church, and spent, a couple of years, on a mission trip to Korea. And we had this conversation about how he portrays characters, and even the ones that typically think of as the villain, and trying to show their point of view, so that he doesn't unfairly weight one or the other just because that's what he thinks. And I really like that. I think it really, it makes for a richer experience, and probably separates, great fantasy from, the kind of pulpy novels that we read, throw away, and grab the next one. I think that's what really makes for an immersive world. Yeah.
And like, it separates it from both the pulpy novels and the preachy novels.
Yes, yes.
And because neither one of them gets you where you really want to be. And I know Brandon very well, and Brandon and I don't agree on everything, but we are friends anyway. And that's sort of what I think is the big takeaway here. I mean, the two, sort of primary characters in my series, the ones who are both considered to be the chosen one of their own individual cultures, are in some ways best friends who love each other and would die for each other. And yet, at more than one time during the course of the series, they try and kill each other, because despite the fact that they care so much about each other and have so much in common, there are a few key differences in their belief systems that keep putting them into conflict over and over and over again. And, their belief that for the greater good, we have to do X, sometimes becomes an irreconcilable difference. But one of the things that I like sort of showing is, well, even those seemingly irreconcilable differences can be reconciled if you are willing to resist the urge to take offense, and really try to see the other side of things sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. The The Demon Cycle, the main story is finished. We talked about that last year with the final book. But you've got these 4 novellas that you've written. What purpose do the novellas serve, either to advance or to fill in the main story, or as a writer, how do you approach these stories that are outside the main storyline, and what purpose do they serve for you?
Well, the first novella, The Great Bazaar, was meant to be a chapter in The Warded Man, which was the first book in the series. But as I was outlining and writing that book, I found that chapter just, in some ways, didn't fit. It changed the pacing of the book in a way that slowed things down when I wanted them to be speeding up, and took the story in a place like it was a side story that was very important, and I think that showed some things that I really wanted to show about the world. But in the context of the larger book, it didn't fit the pacing. And so I took it out, but it stuck in my mind. And after I finished the novel, I wrote that story anyway, thinking that I don't know, that I would sell it to like a magazine that published short stories or something. And for a while, I couldn't even give that story away because the magazines didn't want a short story that was tied into a larger series. And publishers at that time were not publishing novellas. And so for a while, that story just sort of languished. And then eventually found a home at Subterranean Press, which is a small press publisher in Detroit that just does these amazing, beautiful little books that are collectible and have a lot of artistic value, but are also they're also willing to tie them into a larger series. And so I published that first book, The Great Bazaar, because I thought it really added a lot of context and detail to the world that I'd created. And they only made 1,000 copies of it, and it ended up being this sort of collector's item. I've seen them sell for $1,200 now from that original run.
Whoa, that's insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. Because nobody at that point in my career, like nobody had ever heard of me, and so they made 1,000 of them. And it took a while to sell that 1,000. But then once my career started to expand, it became a real collector's item. And so then from that point on, I started using the novella format as a way to tell these sorts of stories that I would come up with. I would have these amazing ideas for a side adventure, or like I would want to expand on one character or another, and it just wouldn't fit in one of the larger novels. And so I would make them into these sort of self-contained stories that sort of fill in everything you need to know about the world. So theoretically, you could pick up any one of the 4 novellas without having read my novels. And like, there might be a few bits of, info dump about the world that are a little slow, but overall, those stories are things that anybody could read and anybody could relate to and get a sense of what the world is like and what Peter V. Brett books are like. And so the second one, Brian's Gold, was another sort of side adventure of my main character. The third one, Messenger's Legacy, I had written this huge backstory for a character in the third book. And the story got so big that it just was eating up the whole book. And it was a new character and taking away from the main story. And so I cut it out and made that into Messenger's Legacy. And then this fourth one, Barren, which just came out yesterday, was meant to be the 4th novel in the series. I had this big story planned basically from the beginning of book 1. Celia Barren, who's the main character in the novella, is introduced, I think, on the 3rd page of The Warded Man, which is the first book. And I always knew this story was coming. I had this big backstory planned for her. And never got to tell it. And I meant to tell it as book 4 in the series in its own novel. But over the course of the years, the story just got so big and so involved that going back to the small town where it all began just would have been such a now for something completely different moment in the middle of the series that I think that the readers would have rebelled on me. And so I kept it back and finished the story in the way that made the most sense and in the way that kept it tight. But then I really felt like I needed the closure of writing that last book. And so now with this novella out, I feel like the series is really complete.
Yeah. Well, I've had Barren for about a week now, and read it in a couple of sittings. It's just shy of 150 pages long, so not a huge commitment, but very satisfying at the same time. And what's really interesting in this format of book is you can really go deep with the character and bring a lot of detail, a lot of nuance, give us a really great look at a character that if this were placed inside of a novel, I think might be taken as info dumpy or just too much focus on this character. But in this setting, it's perfect. And when you're writing a novella, do you think of it differently as writing a section of a novel? That does the format that it will eventually be published as, does that inform the way you write it?
It absolutely does. It's a different skill set, and it's one that it took me a little while to really get the hang of. I think the novella format, it really focuses on one, maybe two point of view characters and one real story problem. And you can sort of, take your time and explore that. But if you try and go too big, it grows out of control and either turns into a novel or something that's sort of less satisfying. But if you keep the focus on, like one real story problem and one main character, it allows for a deep dive that really, I think, is very satisfying. And so that's something that's been really great, to take a character who, is a supporting cast member in the main series and say, oh, well, they have their own story too, and now I get a chance to tell it in real detail. And that, I think that also, when you go back to the main series, if you go back and reread, suddenly that character has a lot more life than they had before, because now you understand who they are and where they've come from and what they've been through, which are things that I, as the author, have always known, and have always informed my writing of them. But now the readers get to see that too. Celia Barren, in particular, the main character of this new novella, had so much story that that I was holding back, that very much informed my writing of the character throughout the series, but never really got to be revealed. And so I think that if people read this novella and then go back and read her parts of the other books, they'll see it in a whole new light.
Yeah. What does the title Barren allude to?
So when Celia is first introduced, she is one of the town elders in Tibbet's Brook, which is the small town where the story first begins. She's the town speaker. She is a old widow who has never had children. And in a world where humanity has been hunted almost to extinction, there's a lot of pressure on people to have children. And the fact that she never had any was, a matter of quite a bit of small town gossip, and earned her the nickname of Barren. But the character had, since she never had children of her own, had sort of adopted the entire town as her children, and was this really sort of wise town elder who was always, putting people on the right track and giving people lectures when they were acting wrong and settling disputes, and sort of the whole town leaned on her as a parental figure. And so they call her, at first it was meant disrespectfully, but over time she sort of took the name back, and they call her Celia Barren, the woman who made the entire town her children. But from the very beginning of that series, I always knew that she had a secret, and the secret was that she wasn't barren. She was a lesbian, and she had this, sort of sad history that in a town that was sort of intolerant of that sort of thing, and had ended up getting married more for appearances than anything else, and that had sort of informed the character as I was writing her, and it was something that I didn't really have the opportunity to get into the way that I wanted to in the main series, because it's a topic that I really wanted to address properly and in detail, and I didn't want to give away, that thing about her, as sort of a side note. I wanted it to be given its due diligence. And so I held that secret for 10 years until now, when I finally get to release this book. But I think that when people read that and go back and reread the character throughout the series, they'll see, the stuff that was there all along.
Right. You say that telling this story really made you feel like that the demon cycle was finally finished. Having the satisfying experience of being able to tell the story that you've been holding for 10 years, that then makes the rest of the story somehow become more alive, because now you have more information and the lights kind of click on. Is there the temptation to keep writing stories like this that fill in some of the gaps for us readers? And how do you just put the pen down and completely walk away from a series and be satisfied that it's finished?
Well, I mean, the wonderful thing is that I don't ever have to just walk away. I can,
Right.
the wonderful thing about being an author is the omnipotence of being able to, travel in time and go back to a place where, this character who died somewhere in the series, I can go back to a time when they were alive and tell a story about them, before they died, or I can go back and tell a story, that happened 20 years before the series begins, or whatever. And I, not only have I not ruled out doing that, I have notes for other novellas. There are other characters who have stories that I would like to explore more. And I've written notes for other short novellas that I think would add more detail to the series. And these are things that I've had planned, throughout the writing of it. I've got about notes for about 4 other novellas that focus on different characters throughout the series, that I can do sort of at my leisure. And I also have my next project is a series set in the same world that takes place 15 years later. And so I can sort of cycle out all of the characters from the original series, but keep the world and keep the things that I love about it, and start with a whole new cast and go to different places in the world and see different cultures and different places on the map. And so that's something I'm excited to do too. When you create an entire world, there's always new things to explore and new stories to tell that don't affect the old story at all. And so I think of the Demon Cycle series as complete. I think that there's a whole story there that ends with finality and in a satisfying conclusion. But that doesn't mean that I can't pick up and tell other stories in the world as well. And that's certainly something that I intend to do.
Can you tell us anything about the new series other than it's in the same world and 15 years in the future? Is there a problem that we're starting with, or can you give us any clues?
Yeah. Okay. I want to be careful because I don't want to give away anything about the ending of the last series. So a few of the main characters have children over the course of the Demon Cycle. And so the next series will star those children. And so it'll take place about 15 years later when they're teenagers. But it will, and so there will be some cast members from the old series who show up as supporting characters in the beginning, but it will very quickly move away from the familiar places and away from the familiar characters and into new territory. And so if you've read the last book in the series, you know who those main characters are. But it's not something that I really want to give away because I don't want a listener who hasn't read the books to know sort of who lives and who dies and whose children make it to the end.
Sure.
But it'll start in a world that's very changed from the main series, but still has its own set of problems. And it's something that I'm really excited to explore. And I think that the characters that I've come up with are characters unlike anyone, unlike a main character you've ever seen in a fiction novel before. I'll say that. Olive Paper, the main character in the new series, is going to be something people aren't going to expect at all. And I'm really excited to work on that.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to see what you've come up with. Peter, this has been a lot of fun hanging out again and catching up and talking about the new book. If people are just discovering you in this episode for the first time, where can they find you online and dig into all the stuff that you do?
So my website is www.petervbrett.com. So you can find pretty much everything you need there. I'm on all the social medias as PVBRETT, PVBrett. So Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Tumblr, everything. So I'm most active on Instagram and Twitter. So if you want to follow me there, I post fan art and I have contests where we give away books all the time. So if you're interested in that, there's always a chance to get signed books. Pretty much at any given time, we're running some kind of giveaway. So check it out.
Excellent. Peter, we're going to send everybody to pick up a copy of Barren, the new novella out, and the Demon Cycle Saga. And we're going to send everybody to your website. There's links to it in the show notes. Peter, thank you so much for taking time to come back on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Knoll was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke. It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Knoll. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dylan!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond, and in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God, he served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.